Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I am finally getting to my review of Death in the Clouds, or Death in the Air, which celebrates its 90th anniversary in 2025. Christie was so prolific during the 1930s, churning out elite novel after elite novel. We have Lord Edgware Dies, Murder on the Orient Express, Peril at End House, Death on the Nile, so many other truly fantastic mystery novels from the 1930s. And then somehow in that roster of iconic books, we get Death in the Clouds, which falls far short of the quality Christie produced in the 1930s. I think people remember Death in the Clouds as, oh, that's Christie's airplane murder or the one with the bee from the Doctor Who episode, but I always remember it as this like sore thumb that sticks out. It doesn't belong here. Like, I've never been a fan of this novel. It's not outright awful, but it's very lackluster in so many ways. It's disappointing to say the least, but I'll get there. And as a reminder, I will provide a spoiler free summary up until the point of the murderer reveal, at which case I will warn you it's coming so you can back out if you need to. From that point forward, spoilers are fair game. So before I begin, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel. Death in the Clouds begins with the passengers boarding the plane named the Prometheus. They are in Le Pinier, France, or they're really in Paris, France, having most of them coming from Le Pinier, and returning home to England. This is one of those opening chapters Christie likes to do where she treats us to some internal thoughts of some of the characters in the novel, in this case, primarily Jane Grey. Not the beheaded 9 Days Queen, but the hairdresser Jane Grey. She traveled to Les Piniers because she won second place in the Irish sweepstakes and treated herself to a little fashionable vacation. She's traveling back home to London, but she's being very coy because sitting across the aisle from her is dentist Norman Gale, whom she has a massive crush on. Jane recalls an incident that happened with him at a casino roulette wheel where Jane bet her last dollars and she lost, but Norman told her that she had accidentally put her money on the wrong number and wound up winning. Jane knows she didn't do that, and Norman was just being polite and flirty, but she took the money anyway. A similar thing happened in the Mr. Quinn short story, The Soul of the Croupier, which saw Mr. Satterthwaite lose out on a bet he won. It even happens on the same numbers, 5 and 6. Also on board the Prometheus are Hercule Poirot, who is airsick. We know he gets seasick a lot, but now he's airsick. He switches plane seats with Venetia Kerr, or Venetia Carr, I'm not really sure the correct pronunciation, because her friend slash enemy, Lady Cicely Horbury, is also on the flight. And Lady Horbury is a woman who married a wealthy aristocrat, but we're told she's not of that class. She's a chorus girl. Venetia Carr is friends with Lady Horbury, but they also hate each other, and Venetia is in love with Lady Horbury's husband, who is not on the plane. There are some other people on the plane, and we'll get to them eventually. They don't really factor in too much here in the beginning. The plane takes off, and a few mundane things happen. Norman Gale goes to the bathroom, so Jane takes that opportunity to gussy up in her hand mirror. Lady Horbury breaks a nail and summons her maid Madeline to bring her a nail file. Madeline is traveling in the other car cabin of the plane, but she's called in to fetch her Lady Horbury's suitcase. A bee or a wasp buzzes around and bothers a few of the people until it's smushed to death by Jean Dupont, a French archaeologist traveling with his father Armand. There's also like a Dr. Bryant who plays the flute, which I can't imagine anything more annoying than someone playing a flute on an airplane. And Poirot is basically just totally catatonic at this point and huddling in his seat. Shortly before landing, Henry Mitchell, the senior steward, finds another passenger, a Madame Giselle, dead. Initially, he thought she had some kind of like fit, but when Dr. Bryant examines her, he notices that she's been dead for like a half hour at least and has a puncture wound on her neck. Then everyone believes Madame Giselle died from the bee sting after having like an allergic reaction. But Poirot points out that there's something on the floor, and it turns out that something is a poison dart with black and yellow strings resembling a bee. The plane lands, and Inspector James Japp is in charge here. I haven't yet had the opportunity to review a Japp novel, and he's woefully discussed on this channel as he's equally underused in this book. Japp holds all the passengers for interviews and a search. Poirot assists him, as is natural. Japp humorously didn't even recognize Poirot because he was all bundled up after the flight. The short order is that no one saw anything, and again, that's the norm in a Christie novel. Most of the evidence comes from Henry Mitchell, the older steward. He saw Madame Giselle, whose real name is Marie Mariceau, at about like 2 o'clock, and she was alive then, but 15 minutes later, he brought her bill, and she must have been dead then, but he thought she was asleep. No one was seen going near her, and Madame Giselle didn't leave her seat at any point, nor was she seen talking to anyone. We don't even have like a series of interviews with the passengers. We literally just get like paragraphs describing everyone not knowing anything. In general, I find the characters in this novel to be incredibly lacking. Even the big characters like Jane Grey are just like totally nothing to me. A blowpipe was found behind Poirot's chair, which is concerning, although no one was seen using it at any time. Death in the Clouds probably has Christie's most notorious mistake ever. This blowpipe is a foot long, and not the several feet long a blowpipe should be. Christie makes fun of herself in Mrs. McGinty's Dead over this mistake. For the rest of her life, Christie would write about how readers would send her letters over this. She was tired of hearing about it for like 40 years. This happened to her. She would just get letters of people saying she got a blowpipe wrong. The important thing here is that no one claims to have known Madame Giselle. Mr. Daniel Clancy, a mystery writer who is very much our prototype for Mrs. Oliver, admits to owning a blowpipe, but he didn't bring it on the plane. You could never get a blowpipe on an airplane nowadays. This is really funny to me. It's also really funny to me, like how good the service is. These people are having like full course meals on an airplane. He also went to his baggage, which was near Madame Giselle. Mr. James Ryder, a businessman, talks a lot of interesting things about poison darts, and he recognizes it as being South American and very difficult for the average person to secure. The only other remarkable point here is that Venetia Kerr gives her address as Little Paddocks, not that Little Paddocks. This one is in Horbury, Sussex, not Chipping Cleghorn. Poirot notices the blowpipe has what looks like a residue from a sticker on it, implying that it's a purchased novelty and not a genuine blowpipe. At the inquest, we learn that Madame Giselle was a famous Parisian moneylender whose clientele were primarily wealthy English people. A few different passengers are called to give evidence, but no one really says anything enlightening. No one saw anything. No one saw anyone use a blowpipe. The only bit of intrigue at all comes from Mr. Clancy, who, once mentioned he passed by the dead woman, throws kind of a fit, but that's all cleared up. And we're told because this murder happened on an airplane, it's become a media sensation and everyone became notorious. The jury comes back with a verdict of guilty against Poirot, which is really funny. I mean, honestly, this is the highlight of the book here. But the coroner throws that out as ridiculous. But this does motivate Poirot to clear his name of suspicion. The jury definitely went like full xenophobia on Poirot. Japp seems to think the murderer is one of or both the Duponts, the father and son archaeologists. His reasoning is mostly because they're French, but they were sitting near Madame Giselle. They are the same nationality as Madame Giselle, and because they're archaeologists, they may have traveled to South America where they could have procured this poison, which we are told comes from the boomslang snake and is not easily obtainable. Meanwhile, our hairdresser, Jane Grey, has fallen hard for our dentist, Norman Gale. They go to tea after the inquest, where they are harassed by a tabloid reporter from the Weekly Howl, which is a fantastic name for a tabloid. Both are concerned about the notoriety of this murder will have on their careers. They both agree to see what they can do about this murder because each knows the other is innocent because they were staring madly in love and infatuated with each other the entire flight. And I'll admit, just straight up here, I was not at all interested in this romance between Jane and Norman. Poirot and Japp meet with Monsieur Fournier from the Sûreté. He's a friend of Monsieur Giroux from Murder on the Links. Poirot did not forget him, and he has some fun digs there. But Madame Giselle has a bit of a reputation. She was not a particularly nice moneylender, but she was honest. She would collect secrets about her clients as collateral. So if they failed to pay up, she would reveal their secrets. Essentially, she was blackmailing her clients, and if they didn't pay, she would reveal their secrets to whoever she needed to. But she never used those secrets for anything other than collateral. She never blackmailed them for the purposes of greed. She also had an estranged daughter whose name is Anne Morisot, who is her heiress, but Anne wasn't on the plane. Madame Giselle's maid Elise also inherited some money, and Elise also burned all of her boss's papers when she died, as Madame Giselle had ordered to be done to protect her innocent clients. Japp is very confused about most of the things, as he's wont to be. He's mostly obsessed with the blowpipe and wondering, like, why someone would choose that murder weapon on an airplane and who on earth someone used, like, I mean, how on earth someone used it without being seen in such close quarters. Keeping in mind, Christie thinks a blowpipe is much smaller than one actually is, which makes this point even more relevant, honestly. Poirot is not so concerned about this, although he doesn't immediately state why. Japp provides Poirot with a list of items on everyone's luggage and person. Poirot wanted this because he was looking for a specific item, although he didn't know like what item exactly, but he would know when he saw it. And Poirot says he found that item on the list, but he says it's on the totally wrong person. He wasn't expecting that item on that person. He does not say what item or what person, and that complicates this summary because I'm not really going to say what that item is here because that will spoil it, and I can't go through the list because it's very long, and if I like pick out the right one, it'll be spoilery. So just know that. Poirot and Fournier traveled to Paris to look into Madame Giselle's papers and things. On the one on the plane, Fournier experiments with the blowpipe and realizes that no matter what he does, there's always someone who can easily see him. And because Christie underestimates the size of the blowpipe, the reality is actually more in her favor here. A real size blowpipe would be even harder to hide. They meet with Elise, who is Madame Giselle's maid, who burnt all of her papers, as her employer requested. She did not burn, however, a black book Madame Giselle usually carried with her, but she had lost. Elise turns it over to Poirot, and it lists certain pieces of blackmail. No names are mentioned, but there are entries about drugs, murder, embezzlement. Elise also talks about her daughter who died and how she bonded with Madame Giselle because she too had a daughter she didn't know. Although Giselle's daughter is still alive, but they are estranged and they've never met. Nonetheless, Madame Giselle did leave her money to this daughter, but Elise doesn't know who she is, and she doesn't know who the father was either. Poirot also learns that Lady Horbury not only paid a visit to Madame Giselle, but Madame Giselle seemed to have followed her to Les Piniers. Poirot and Fournier then meet with this representative from Universal Airlines office. He says Elise attempted to make a reservation on the earlier flight to London for her boss, but couldn't because that flight was full, so Madame Giselle had to take the later one. However, Poirot knows the earlier flight was practically empty. And then the man admits that, yeah, he was bribed to put Madame Giselle onto the later flight by an American man with glasses. This same American man apparently purchased the blowpipe from an antiquities store from a Greek shopkeeper, and oh boy, is his ethnicity mentioned a lot. We return to England to check up on Jane Grey. She's very popular these days at the salon she works at because everyone is so interested in hearing about her murder that she witnessed, I guess. She didn't really witness it, but obnoxious women flock to Monsieur Antoine's to see and hear Jane, which she very skillfully uses to demand a raise. Monsieur Antoine is a very clear anti Semitic trope. It's not pleasant. But Jane's still enamored with Norman Gale. They bond over their mutual hatred of cats, Catherine Hepburn, and black people. Yes, that is in the text. Although I believe the newer editions actually have removed that line. This is true even before publishers' decisions to remove controversial content from her novels. But and anyway, Norman has seen a lot less success since no one wants to see a dentist who might be a murderer. His dental practice is failing and failing quickly. He says he wants to pack up and go to Canada or maybe New Zealand. They got to dinner and then stalk Mr. Clancy, the mystery writer, around London for a bit. Also stalking Mr. Clancy is one Hercule Poirot back from France. Poirot tells Norman Gale to get lost, as Jane has to pretend to be his secretary when he speaks to Mr. Clancy. Mr. Clancy is a mess, both literally and figuratively. His flat is a total disaster. Yeah, it's like he should be on Hoarders or something. Mr. Clancy is doing very well since the murder because he's going to write a book about it, and he has this idea that the murderer is a female stowaway who hid herself under Madame Giselle's chair, poisoned everyone with gas so they passed out, murdered Madame Giselle, and then jumped out of the plane. Mr. Clancy is very Ariadne Oliver coded here. He is the original Ariadne Oliver. Christie is having fun with him and using him to poke fun at herself and mysteries in general. His books were all cliche name. Ariadne Oliver had just debuted the previous year in the Parker Pine short story, The Case of the Discontented Soldier. So this was something Christie was doing a bit of in the mid 1930s. We don't learn much of anything from Mr. Clancy, nor do we learn much of anything from our check ins with any of the other characters. In these few chapters, Christie's doing, routine check-ins with many of the Prometheus passengers where we learn mostly nothing. It's her reminding her of these people that they exist because, quite frankly, it's very easy to forget. One of my biggest criticisms of this book is just how bad the characters are, and that is partially because many of them are just ignored for large chunks of the story. The one character who actually is useful here is Albert Davis. He was the younger steward on the plane. He's been having a grand old time since the murder. He enjoyed it. And he tells Poirot that when he was cleaning up the plane, Madame Giselle's saucer had two spoons on it. And he's not sure how that happened because everyone else had a spoon, so it didn't come from another passenger. He also notes that two spoons is symbolic of an upcoming marriage. And he thinks that means he's going to get married to the nice looking dairymaid he has the hots for. Poirot tasks Norman Gale with a little bit of blackmailing. Poirot wants to confirm if Lady Horbury was one of Madame Giselle's clients. We've previously seen Poirot actually go to the place where the Horburys live. I skipped it over. It's not important. But anyway, Norman Gale comes up with this whole disguise as Mr. Robinson, the blackmailer. It's very over the top to the point where you can smell the gum paste on him. Apparently, Niall Marsh would have had issues with him, but so does Poirot, who tells him to change his disguise and insults his acting. To which Norman Gale says he's actually a very good actor and did theater in school. I think you all know what that means. Despite Norman's constant complaints that Poirot is going to get him sent to jail for blackmail, Norman's task is successful. He does get Lady Horbury to admit she was a client of Madame Giselle's, which we kind of already knew. Norman and Jane are confused by Poirot's targeting of Lady Horbury because they know she didn't commit the murder. They were sitting across from her on the flight, and they know she never left her seat, nor did she use a blowpipe. Poirot meets up with Japp again, who was missing for way too long, in my opinion, and they discuss the case. Japp realizes what Poirot recognized from the start, that the blowpipe was meant to be found. It could have been sent out of the ventilators on the plane, so someone wanted it to be found, which Poirot and Japp know means that it wasn't used in the commitment of the murder at all. As Fournier demonstrated, it was impossible to use it without being seen. But Poirot speculates about this psychological moment. That is the moment when everyone's attention is distracted by something else, so the murderer can do what they need to do. Japp, meanwhile, wonders if there was some other way to get that blow dart into Madame Giselle. And this is where I think that list of items everyone comes in handy. And there are items that I suppose could be used as a blowpipe. Like the Duponts had pipes from an archaeological dig. Mr. Ryder had a flute. Dr. Bryant had a flute. Pretty much everyone had something that could have been used as a blowpipe. But Poirot is still thinking about that wasp. He's obsessed with that wasp. And Poirot asks Jane to become his personal secretary full-time as he travels back to Paris. Jane is out of a job because she snapped at an obnoxious customer. And while they're in Paris, Poirot keeps pushing Jane to Jean Dupont, that is the archaeologist's son. Jean Dupont is in love with Jane, and we just see a little teensy bit of that where they had some weird views on female murder victims. Poirot even goes so far as to ask Armand Dupont, that is the father, to hire Jane as a secretary when they go on their next expedition. Poirot basically bribes him to do so. He also tells Jane to take this job, which to me is extremely clear what Poirot is trying to do here, but I'll hold that off for the spoiler section. After that, Poirot receives word that Anne Morisot has come to claim her inheritance. Anne is the estranged daughter of Madame Giselle, and we get a very complicated explanation of her backstory, but the short version is that she's Madame Giselle's daughter and she can prove it. She's now Anne Richards, as she has married. Poirot has the feeling that he's seen Anne somewhere, but can't quite figure it out, and his bafflement lasts about a page and a half because Jane breaks a nail and grabs a file. Poirot then realizes where he's seen Anne before. She's Madeline. Who is Madeline, you might ask? Madeline is Lady Horbury's maid who was not only on the plane, but also walked past Madame Giselle. This is such a classic Christie thing where like nobody pays attention to the help. Multiple people testified no one walked near Madame Giselle and no one from the other plane car entered the one Poirot was in, but that wasn't true. People forget the help. So it seems like Madeline slash Anne Richards must have murdered Madame Giselle. Poirot calls Lady Horbury, who tells him that, yeah, her maid just like inexplicably up and left her employment. Really suspicious, except Anne herself turns up dead from an apparent suicide on a boat ride back to England. And this is where I end my spoiler free summary, so back out now if you don't want to be spoiled. You've been warned. Poirot makes a few more inquiries, but let's be honest, he's known who the killer was from the very beginning, from when he saw that list of items on the passengers. He invites Japp and Fournier to a summation gathering. Also in attendance are Norman Gale and Mr. Clancy, so Mr. Clancy can see how a real detective operates. As Poirot explains, he knew kind of right away who the murderer was and what had to have happened, but he couldn't prove it. Poirot knew the blowpipe was an obvious red herring. No one could have used it without being seen, and moreover, even if they could, there were ways to get the blowpipe out of the plane through the ventilation system. So the blowpipe was nothing but misdirection. So what other ways could the murder have occurred? Well, as we know from the list of items the passengers had, there could be like makeshift blowpipes. Lady Horbury had a cigarette holder. Dr. Bryant had a flute. The Duponts had old pipes. And if that's unconvincing to you, it should be because Poirot doesn't buy it either. So what other way could Madame Giselle have been murdered? How did that poison dart get into her neck? Well, if it wasn't with a blowpipe or a similar item, then it had to be by hand. Very few people went near Madame Giselle. One of them is Mr. Clancy, and he gets pretty angry at that suggestion. There was Anne slash Madeline, but she's dead, and Poirot does not believe she committed suicide. He thinks she was murdered. Moreover, Madeline slash Anne wasn't supposed to be on the plane in the first place, as this murder was pre-planned. There's also the stewards, but Poirot doesn't really suspect them. So what other clues are there? Poirot says the murderer put the poison dart into Madame Giselle by hand and then created the psychological moment to distract the other passengers. That psychological moment was the wasp. The wasp, Poirot reasons, must have been intentionally released mid-flight because there was no wasp when the plane took off, and since the plane is thousands of feet up in the air, like it didn't fly in, the wasp had to come from somewhere, and we return to that list of items. Norman Gale had an empty matchbox that could be perfect for securing a wasp. The wasp was a distraction, so the murderer could do what they had to do. And Poirot continues on about the wasp. And then Norman Gale asks him, well, at what point did Poirot stop suspecting him? And Poirot answers, never. He never stopped believing Norman Gale was guilty. Here's how he did it. And this plot, it's not the tightest here, but anyway, it works, at least. Norman Gale is a dentist, and despite being on vacation, he brought his white dentist coat with him, which is odd. He didn't need that on vacation. He struck up a romance with Jane Grey and was sitting across the way from her on the plane. Norman excused himself to use the bathroom. This was mentioned a few times, but the bathroom was in the opposite direction of Madame Giselle, so no one thought anything of it. While in the restroom, Norman put on his white coat and stuffed his cheeks with cotton to make him look like a steward because, again, no one pays attention to the stewards. The real stewards were in the other plane cabin at the time. He grabbed a spoon from the steward's area and brought it over to Madame Giselle, where he placed the spoon on her saucer, stabbed her with the poisoned dart, and returned to the bathroom to transform back into his regular self. Poirot argues no one would notice because no one pays attention to the stewards. It's a bit iffy there for me, but he also argues that Jane wouldn't recognize Norman because when such an attractive man goes to the bathroom, Jane would naturally look at herself in the hand mirror in his absence, which she does do, but again, it doesn't necessarily mean that, in my opinion. So why did Norman do this? Well, because he's married to Madeline slash Anne and wanted Madame Giselle's money she inherited. Norman Gale's real name was Norman Richards, and he grew up on a South African snake farm, so he knew all about snake poison. Sure, I guess. We were not told that the farm he grew up on was a snake farm at any time. Also, we were told repeatedly the snake poison came from South America, but now it's South Africa. There's a bit of an error there. And because he's married to Anne slash Madeline, Norman knew all about Lady Horbury, and that Lady Horbury was indebted to Madame Giselle and could not pay up. So Norman decided to frame Lady Horbury for the murder. It's not entirely clear to me if Anne Madeline was in on this plan. I'm inclined to think not. Like Poirot seems to think not. Although how on earth like she didn't suspect anything after the murder is a little questionable. Norman was coaching Anne on how to act and basically scaring her into thinking she could be suspected of murder if the police found out she was on the Prometheus. Anne claimed the money and traveled by boat back to England, and on that boat, Norman Gale poisoned her with prussic acid to make it look like suicide. This all works, but there are holes here. I mean, mainly in the framing of Lady Horbury. It makes sense that Norman would choose her as a target because she owes money to Madame Giselle, and Anne works for her, so she can know like what she does and how she acts. But there are pieces that don't make sense. I have no idea why Norman planted the blowpipe behind Poirot's chair. It's supposed to incriminate Lady Horbury. It seems like Christie forgot Poirot switched seats with Venetia Kerr and not Lady Horbury. The whole thing about Norman Gale pretending to blackmail Lady Horbury on Poirot's behalf was just a ploy for Poirot to see how good of an actor Norman Gale is, which is he admitted he was a good one, and that him overdoing all the makeup and the gum paste and all that, that was an act. As Poirot said, no one, even with zero theater experience, would be so bad at applying makeup, so Norman Gale had to intentionally be faking it to hide his skills. And Norman Gale gets naturally pretty mad here and says Poirot has no proof, he's just making it up. And Poirot says, yeah, he does have proof. There were fingerprints on that bottle of prussic acid Madeline was holding. And Norman says that's impossible because, and he stops. And Poirot finishes the sentence that he wore gloves. So Norman Gale has incriminated himself. I actually think when I made my video on the worst mistakes made by Christie killers, I said Norman Gale said this about the poison dart. That's not right. It's about the poison bottle. It's implied that the reason why Norman killed Anne is because he fell in love with Jane and wanted to marry her. Poirot says Norman would have killed Anne eventually to keep the money for himself, but was forced to kill her sooner because of Jane. With Norman Gale arrested, Jane takes up Poirot's offer to accompany Jean Dupont to Persia. And I couldn't help but to think of this love triangle of Jane Grey, Norman Gale, Jean Dupont as Agatha Christie, Archie Christie, Max Mallowan, with Jane and Christie both taking the archaeologist in the end. It's a rare Christie love triangle that is one man, two women. Usually the more prominent ones are one man, two women. Praise. And I have to be honest, I really don't have a lot of specific praise for this novel. And while this isn't like the worst of the worst, there just isn't much this book has going for it, especially things unique to it. I think the plot is very creative. It has the trappings and the makings of a fun Christie murder plot. I think Norman Gale dressing up as the steward is fun. I like how it plays off, the common Christie trope that no one pays attention to the servants or the working class. I liked how Christie incorporated the passengers' luggage as clues. That's a lot of fun trying to figure out, like, which items could be used somehow into the plotting of this murder. I think the actual murder plot is good. It's not like an all-time great, but it has, that Christie cleverness to it. I also think there are some moments of this plot that are a lot of fun. The jury at the inquest trying to indict Poirot was funny. Poirot makes a lot of snide comments about Gerard from Murder on the Links, which are funny. Poirot and Japp's relationship is fun here as well. We don't see a lot of it, unfortunately. No, Murder by Poison Dart is original here. I don't believe Christie uses poison darts in any other mystery novel or short story, at least not off the top of my head. Death in the Clouds feels like that mid-career Poirot where he still, retains a lot of the private detective feel, but is also sort of like branching out. He doesn't have a client here. He is his own client, trying to prove his innocence. I don't really have a lot of praise for this book. Like, I just don't. It's a perfectly fine book, I guess. It's not like a struggle to read. Now, when I ranked every Poirot novel, I had Death on the Clouds at number 25 of 33 Poirots. And the good news here is that I don't think it drops any. I mean, the books I have below it are The Clocks, Halloween Party, Mystery of the Blue Train. Those are the ones like directly below it, and I think it's better than those. So it definitely doesn't move up and it doesn't move down. So at least my opinion of this book did not fall on this reread. Moving on to criticism, which is a lot lengthier of a section. I mean, the main issue I have, and it sort of bleeds into all these other problems, is that the characters in this book are just not good. They're all bland and flat and uninteresting. Every single one of them, basically, at least of the one time characters. Norman Gale is probably the best one time character, and he's really like nothing of note. I did not care at all about Jane Grey. I mean, she's extremely flat and dull. I did not care about her relationship with Norman Gale, and I cared even less about her relationship with Jean Dupont, which is barely even featured. I mean, so many of the passengers are just boring beyond belief and significantly underdeveloped. Like, Mr. Clancy is fine, but like Dr. Bryant, Mr. Ryder, you can't even keep them straight. And Christie tries so hard to get us to suspect these people of murder and to care about them, but they're barely featured in the book, and when they are, it's just sort of like perfunctory, like just like randomly checking in with someone to remind you they're still there. And there's nothing going on. The Duponts are largely out of it until the very end, when we're supposed to like them all of a sudden. Lady Horbury is not a good character. I mean, we've seen this type of character a lot in mystery novels, and almost every version of her is better than Lady Horbury. I did not care about Norman and Jane, and I certainly didn't care about this love triangle between Lady Horbury, Lord Horbury, and Venetia Kerr. There's actually another love triangle of Lady Horbury, Lord Horbury, Raymond Barkalow, who is this actor Lady Horbury's having an affair with. I did not care about this at all. Like, I have no idea why this is part of the story. Venetia Kerr is another pretty lackluster character, and we're supposed to be like rooting for her to get with Lord Horbury. It's just like, I don't care. Like, they're barely in the story, and that's a big problem. Besides Jane and Norman, we don't see a lot of the one-time characters, and certainly not enough to believe they're viable suspects. Christie put so many iconic novels out during the 1930s. It's like that she took a little break here with Death in the Clouds and just put this one out, as she didn't work as hard on it. I don't want to say that, but that's what it feels like. And the bad characters leak into other problems. Like, I don't find any of the romances interesting. Norman Gale is a pretty obvious murderer, especially by like the midpoint where Poirot keeps trying to get Jane to hook up with Jean Dupont instead of Norman. It's like, it's obvious he's doing this because he knows Norman is a murderer. Like, there's no other reason to be doing this. And the murder plot is fun, and it's one of those ones where you just have to go along with it for the sake of the story, which is totally fine. I don't mind that at all, because you should be willing to suspend belief for the sake of the good mystery. But the minute you start thinking about this murder plot, it just falls apart. There are a lot of, coincidences and conveniences. And the fact that no one noticed Norman was the steward is strange. I know Christie says, well, nobody pays attention to the steward, but the way he has to go about, it doesn't work. I think the reason why Jane and Poirot don't notice Norman Gale makes sense, but he has to walk past a lot of other people, including people who are looking directly upward. Presumably, some of the passengers are looking upward for various reasons, like someone's playing the flute or whatever. And he also has to walk in and out of the bathroom, and the bathroom is located right in front where Lady Horbury and Venetia Kerr are sitting. And if you look at the map chart of the plane that's provided at the beginning of the book, they're seated right in front of the bathroom. Like, I don't understand how he thought he could pass off the murder happening by a blowpipe, and why he didn't just grab the poison dart after he stabbed Madame Giselle. Like, we're told she died instantly. There's a lot of Norman's backstory that just is withheld from us until the very end, like him having lived on a snake farm and him being with this girl who committed suicide, allegedly. There are times when Poirot is wondering who Giselle's daughter could be, and he does briefly suspect Jane Grey because she was an orphan, but Christie writes this as if it was some kind of like long-running plot of red herring, but it's barely mentioned in the book. And we also have some unfortunate, anti-Semitism. Some of Jane's customers are clearly Jewish and depicted very poorly. Including the Christie classic of saying they have voices like corncrakes. They're not explicitly said to be Jewish, but the implication is clear. Same thing with her boss, Monsieur Antoine. Christie often depicts like hardships of characters as partly that they work for Jewish people and that just like adds to their misery. It's not great. And then we have that unfortunate comment of Norman and Jane bonding over their hatred of black people in a way that's supposed to be endearing to us. Very rare for Christie. There are plot holes and errors in this book, and there's two of them. One is the aforementioned blowpipe length, which doesn't really bother me that much. Christie makes fun of herself for that. Mrs. McGinty's dead. She's aware of it. It's sort of, endearing in a way, I guess. And the other mistake is that Poirot swaps seats with Venetia Kerr, but Norman Gale tries to frame Lady Horbury by putting the blowpipe behind her seat, but it's actually found behind Poirot's seat, which makes me think he was supposed to swap seats with Lady Horbury, but it's explicitly stated multiple times he swapped with Venetia Kerr. And actually, coming into this novel, I didn't even remember that. Would have sworn he swapped seats with Lady Horbury. I think this novel is well below average in pretty much everything I look for when I assess mystery novels without ever failing in any category. It avoids academic probation, but it's hovering there. And, it's never going to make like the Dean's List or the Honor Roll or anything like that. Let's move on to characters here. Poirot was fine. I think there are better Poirots for sure, in terms of like Poirot content, but I did enjoy Poirot here. His response to the jury trying to indict him was funny. I liked his interactions with Japp and Fournier and his digs at Giraud. I like how he had set up Norman Gale to blackmail Lady Horbury. He's very active in this novel. He's not doing the usual sit back and think, although to be fair, he does kind of know what happened immediately. He just has to prove it. So he doesn't have to do a lot of the thinking because he already knows the answer. And like I said, I think there are better Poirot novels out there in terms of, Poirot content. But Poirot is definitely one of the brighter things about this novel. There's not a lot going for it. So Poirot was the least fun presence here. And we have Inspector Japp, who didn't really get a lot to do here, but when he was on the page, I really enjoyed him. And that's because Japp doesn't travel to Paris, so he's doing his own thing in England, so we're not really with him. We don't see what he's doing, but he was a lot of fun with Poirot. I wouldn't say there was like a lot of bickering with Poirot or, him being baffled by Poirot like we see in a lot of other novels. But we do have like a lot of the regular Japp content, like him proclaiming the superiority of the British over the French, especially in the police, and him insisting the Duponts had to be guilty because they're French. It was all the typical Japp stuff you would want from him, though I wanted more Japp because, Fournier was fine, but like Inspector Japp would have been preferred. Our murderer is Norman Gale, who was fine. I ranked him somehow number 18 of 100 Christie killers. That is way too high. I think he should be relatively high because he's extremely devious and evil, and I like the complexity he had with his relationship with Jane and that he really did love her. And I love a good like ruthless cruel murderer, but 18 was way too high. He is not that interesting. He stands out as interesting because everyone else in the novel is a complete dud. He's a sloppy as a murderer, doing things like saying he wore gloves to avoid fingerprints, and his plan, it worked, but again, it relied on a lot going right outside of his control. He does a particularly poor job of disguising himself as the blackmailer, which does nothing but play right into Poirot's pretty obvious trap here. And I think where he goes wrong, as a character, is that he's just not interesting. Like, we don't get to know him beyond the surface level, and a lot of his background is withheld from us. Like when he mentions his dental practice is failing, the reader doesn't really care or feel anything for him like we're supposed to. We've been made to care about Norman Gale in the way we should, considering he's, the only murderer here, but also one of the main people pushing the investigation and the plot forward. But we're just haven't been made to care that much about him. I know Christie is trying to pull the wool over our eyes and present this ruthless killer as, the nice guy, but that nice guy never comes through in any meaningful way. So I would lower him on my murderer ranking quite a bit, from number 18 to like number 50, honestly. I know that's a big drop, and I do stand by what I said originally by putting him that high, but, to be honest, he's just not interesting enough to justify it any further. Onto our victims. We have our main victim, Madame Giselle, and she did make my top 15 victim characters. Again, I think she probably gets knocked off that list after this reread if I were to make that video again. But she doesn't like have a big drop. She's characterized very well. I loved what we learned about her and how she's this ruthless, vicious moneylender and blackmailer, but she has a moral code. She doesn't want to harm people who pay. She does not use these secrets for monetary gain. She only uses them to get her money back. Christie humanizes her in regards to her backstory about her daughter, and she's a fascinating character. And one of these Christie victims we never actually meet in the flesh. We only know her after she's dead, and everything we know about her comes from other people. I love when Christie does this, and I think she does a good job here, though I don't think she does like a spectacular job here. I wish Madame Giselle at least had been on the page while alive, because she seems like she would have been this commanding figure that this novel was lacking amongst the one-time characters. And our other victim is Anne Morisseau slash Madeline. And there's not really much to say here. I mean, we never get to know her as either personality much. And that's intentional. We're supposed to forget about Madeline because she's the help and no one pays attention to the help. And Christie uses that twice in this book. And she uses it, I think, effectively. At least effectively enough. The passengers even say no one from the other cabin came in because they don't consider servants people. So in that regards, it makes sense why we don't know much about Madeline or Anne. I think we're supposed to assume Madeline slash Anne is not in on Norman's plans, but that's a little difficult to believe. I mean, first of all, Norman didn't really intend on murdering Anne, at least not right away, until Jane showed up. And when Anne goes to collect the money, she's definitely putting on an act. Like, she's intentionally dodging questions and whatnot and just being coy with them. Poirot explains this away as, well, that's what Norman told her to do, but, like, why would he tell her to do that? Like, why does she believe this? Like, I understand her not saying she was on the plane. That makes sense. But, like, it definitely seems like she's in on the act here. And we're never given any reason to believe Anne is, like, gullible or afraid of her husband either. So, I mean, it all works. It all fits with Anne, but it doesn't, like, snap together in that satisfying Christie way we're used to. Jane Grey is a really terrible character. I mean, to me, she's one of the hardest flops in all of Christie character wise. She's built up to be this great heroine in the likes of like Anne Bedingfeld or Tuppence or like Henrietta Savernake from The Hollow, but she's so flat and dull. Like, I did not care about her at all. I just didn't. She was uninteresting and dull. She's supposed to have these fun moments, like when she negotiates for her raise, but that moment is delegated to a short paragraph that's nothing of note. And I wasn't invested in her relationship with Norman Gale, and even less so with Jean Dupont. And we're also supposed to believe she's a prime suspect because she's an orphan and Madame Giselle's daughter was estranged and put up for adoption, but that point is not hammered home enough for it to work. Like, it's extremely passive. And she didn't play any, like, brilliant role in the solution of the mystery like these heroines typically do. And it's so strange because I think there's a little tiny bit of Agatha Christie in Jane Grey, but she's not Christie like. But on the other hand, Christie didn't necessarily see herself in the same light as we do. There's a little bit of revisionism here, I think, with Christie in regards to her personal relationships and the way they play out via Jane Grey. But I did not like Jane Grey at all. She was a flop. Lady Horbury, maiden name Bland, if that was ever appropriate. And as I already stated, we see a lot of her archetype in mystery novels, and she's one of the worst iterations of them. We don't see a lot of her, but we hear a lot about her, And a lot of it just like doesn't stick because we see so little of her. Like I do get this nasty, selfish woman persona, but it's like barely there, and it's only there because the reader's been tuned in for it. Like she doesn't do anything original or unique or interesting, and she's involved in two love triangles, neither of which are as interesting as Jane's, which really says something. And she was so obviously the main suspect that it was clear it wasn't going to be her. I mean, it wasn't like this like red herring of, oh, the most obvious person actually did do it. Like it was clear it was not going to be her. And she has this rivalry with Venetia Kerr that wasn't interesting at all. And she's supposed to be this like wild femme fatale, but she was just dull all around. Daniel Clancy is probably the best character who wasn't Norman Gale. He was fine. I mean, he's a prototype for Ariadne Oliver. You know, Christie uses him to speak her mind about her career. His apartment is a mess, and he's very excited to witness a detective firsthand. There was much more characterization with him than there were with other characters. I would get some funny like book titles from him and like what his writing methods are. You know, I think Christie had a lot of fun with him, but I think she should have been used more. I mean, none of the passengers are really used a lot in this book. I liked how Clancy is constantly thinking up plots for his books and performing experiments for them that make him suspicious. He has some like really like far-fetched ideas about how the murder could have happened, and it has to sort of be like reined in. You do feel like that, oh, that's definitely Agatha Christie here. You know, Christie used to do similar things like this. You know, she writes about how she would trick and deceive her family and friends to see if like the sleights of hand from her books would work in real life. So I think she had a lot of fun with him. It's still not like an all-time great or anything, but you know, he was there. It's fine. Armand and Jean Dupont were barely in this book, which made it very difficult to believe they were the murderers despite Japp's insistence. It also made it hard for me to care about Jean's pursuit of Jane. You know, Armand the father is barely even a character. Jean, we also barely see, but at least he was in it a little more. And when we did see him, he was kind of a creeper. I mean, he just shows up halfway through the novel at the salon Jane works at and starts flirting with her by discussing the attractiveness of female murder victims. This was not at all charming, like it was when Dr. Griffith flirts with Joanna by showing her diseased organs in the moving finger. I mean, Jean Dupont is very Max Mallowan coded, you know, the Silver Knight who came out of nowhere to rescue Jane from her terrible relationship with the man she actually loves. Again, that's not really what happened with Max and Agatha, but that's how I would interpret this. You know, the Duponts are not great characters considering what their alleged importance is supposed to be. Venetia Kerr, and like, what is there to say about her? I mean, she's a country lady in love with Lord Horbury, hates her friend Lady Horbury. We're supposed to care a lot about her, but I didn't, and I don't know anything about her other than she likes horses. I mean, she's supposed to be a suspect for reasons like not really provided. Like, I don't know why she would murder Madame Giselle. I think even the fact that the Suchet episode expands her role here is a pretty good indicator of how lackluster she is in the novel. That is something I look for when assessing characters, like how were they treated in the Suchet adaptations? And when things change, that usually indicates, though not always, but it usually indicates the character just wasn't that good to begin with. And speaking of lackluster, we have Dr. Bryant, who played the flute, and that made him a suspect. Like, he's another one of these characters who is barely seen, whose business is suffering as a result of the murder. There is some, like, little intrigue, not even really intriguing, but about him, like, having certain medications, there's, like, drugs, maybe. Christie tries to present him as a suspect. It flops pretty hard just because he's, like, barely in the book and not very interesting. Same thing for Mr. Ryder, who did have like a little bit more suspect potential, but it was squandered. You know, in Giselle's Black Book, there was a mention of a businessman needing a loan, and his initials were there, but it really went nowhere. And this wasn't even like a red herring that went nowhere. Like, it went nowhere because it just wasn't explored, even though he apparently did get money from Madame Giselle, but just like nothing went with it. Like, it just happened and then didn't. Like, it was never treated as if this was like, oh, he could have murdered her. Like, it just wasn't convincing. And we have the two stewards in Henry Mitchell and Albert Davis, who did have potential. Henry is the older one, and he does provide some information. His wife is, you know, a real character in the one moment we see her. She has views on things. Albert is the younger one, and we saw less of him, but I actually found him more interesting. Like, he really enjoyed the murder and was milking it for all it's worth. Like, he's become very popular, and he thinks he's finally going to marry his girlfriend, the dairymaid. They were underutilized for sure. They had potential, but again, not much going on there. And that is it for this video. Let me know what you think about Death in the Clouds. Again, as you could tell, not my favorite Christie novel, and when I was writing this script for this video, I was like, oh, it was just dragging on and on. But anyway, next week, I was supposed to discuss my favorite mystery video games. I decided to change that. I will make that video at some point, and I would like to see some like these mystery games catch on because they're a lot of fun, and you could just watch them as if you're watching like a movie. There's particularly some very good Sherlock Holmes ones I think people will like. But the reason why I pushed this one back is because I've gained a lot of new followers recently. I suspect many of you are just not like that into video games. So I thought with these large follower increase that I would present next week a video that I think appeals to a lot more people. So I will be continuing in my series of could these mystery novels work in 2025. I've already discussed Miss Marple, and next week I will discuss And Then There Were None, and whether or not it is possible to pull that plot off in 2025. I know I'll do the Poirots and the other standalones later, but I did feel like And Then There Were None was interesting enough and important enough to warrant its own video, so stay tuned for that. Until next time, Mystery Files.